One night the boy I loved invited me to drive and talk all night. He parked and held me tight. When he smiled and looked at me, there was nowhere else to be. Don't call, don't try, don't go anywhere. My heart has never been so clear. I don't need to be anywhere. Don't go, don't drive, don't go anywhere. Anywhere but here. That's a little section of a song entitled Anywhere But Here, which I co-wrote with my collaborator, Tom Gualtieri. It was inspired by conversations about growing up queer in small-town America. Hi, my name is David Sisco. My pronouns are he, him, and welcome to my podcast, Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. This podcast is dedicated to the art and practice of teaching singers. It is an extension of my book of the same title, which has just been released by Routledge Press. I grew up in a small one-stoplight town in central New York, a geographical area most New Yorkers, myself included, often refer to as upstate. I had a pretty good childhood, all things considered. Wonderful family, great friends, a supportive church community. But there was something not normal about me, and I knew it from a very early age. It wasn't until about fifth grade that I began to understand my difference and, more accurately, tried to suppress it. I was a model student, A's in pretty much every class. I was an active member of the community. At seniors night, an award ceremony given the week of my high school graduation, I received this wonderful award called the Seeds of Selflessness Award. And while hopefully this was a natural part of who I was and how I was raised, there was more than a little part of me that was constructing as perfect a life as possible, knowing that I would not be accepted for who I was. I look back on those days of overachievement, of appeasement, of hiding, and now I can see how many issues that created in my personal and even in my early professional life, and how long it took me to unravel those threads of unworthiness. My journey has necessarily impacted the way I teach and attempt to support students on their own journey. Well, there are many people who have different intersections of identity who experience far more hardship simply for being who they are. And we need not look any further than today's news to see how transgender and genderqueer people are having their rights completely stripped away. And whether this causes big T or little t trauma, it can manifest in many different ways, and even, especially, in educational spaces. And so today, we're going to talk about how to co-create safe learning spaces for trans and genderqueer students, and how in creating space for this community, we're actually creating a more equitable space of belonging for all people of different backgrounds and identities. And boy, do I have the perfect guest for this discussion. It is my distinct pleasure to introduce you to my special guest for this episode, William Sauerland. William, he, they, is Associate Professor of Music and Director of Choral Studies at Purdue University Fort Wayne, where they conduct choirs, teach applied voice, and lead courses in music education. A former member of the Grammy-winning ensemble Chanticleer, Sauerland maintains an active career as a countertenor. Their research centers on identity, queerness, and equity in music education. They are the author of the book Queering Vocal Pedagogy, Rowman and Littlefield, and chapters through GIA publications, Oxford University Press, Pavon Publishing, and Routledge. Sauerland holds degrees from Columbia University, the Royal College of Music, and Miami University. Billy, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you.
Oh gosh, I'm so happy to have you here. I've been such a fan of your book since it came out. Was it 2018? Am I making that up?
2022.
2022. I don't know why I had it. Of course, everything time-wise is, since the pandemic is.
I'll tell you why. It's because my dissertation on the same topic came out in 2018.
Oh, okay, great.
So, or I mean, I don't know if that's the case, but I wonder, right,
Yes,
when I first started to publish on this topic was 2018. So,
I love it. I love it. I'm just such a big fan of yours, and so glad to finally have an opportunity to meet you with you and talk to you about your great work. Um, so I'm a big fan of origin stories, especially on the podcast. And so I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about how you came to conceive of queering vocal pedagogy.
and thank you actually starting with an origin story because I think our backgrounds provide context in a way that nothing else does, right? So I think it is valuable for people to know that I grew up on a dairy farm in the middle of nowhere, Ohio. And I mean that with love, but like from very early on, I knew that farm life and raising cattle and soybeans was not going to be my life trajectory.
Yeah,
And yet that's still where I started, right? I still like fed the cattle and shoveled manure every day before school. And people that actually know me are often very surprised by this because they think I'm like from a big city, but I'm not. I'm just from a cornfield in Ohio. And like the first things I started to sing to was the dairy cattle, right? I mean, it just, my origin
yeah.
story is literally like a scene out of the musical Oklahoma, but maybe with less sexism in it. Um, and I, I was really lucky in that my grandmother had recordings of Judy Garland and Julie Andrews. And
Mm,
so I started to listen to those when I was very young. Who knows what like drew me to that and not the country western music that was on the radio. But sort of I grew up with um, one of the concert albums of Judy Garland and then The Sound of Music. And I was just singing along with those, and those were my idols. In fact, there will be a new chapter coming out about how I talk about Judy, Julie, and Barbara as these sort of archetypes on how I sort of came to form my identity. But that's a whole nother story. Anyway, so I, sort of grew up around musical theater when it really wasn't all that present. Um, and I really wanted to be on stage, and my parents supported that. So I got to be in a small production of The Wizard of Oz, and then I joined band, and then I joined choir, and my choir teacher was like, you're kind of good singer. You should audition for an opera called Amal and the Night Visitors. And Amal, I was 12 at the time, and Amal is a young soprano. And everybody in my life basically thought there's no way you're getting this professional contract, right? Like I think my mother and father thought, oh yeah, Billy can sort of sing. But then I got hired by this opera company, and my world, that scene when Dorothy steps into Oz for the first time into Munchkin Land. I mean, that's what it was like, but times
yeah.
10, where I was just like, oh my gosh, there are people that care deeply about art and music and authenticity and beauty in ways that I had just never really seen before. So my whole life at this point, I'm still young, was now wrapped up into opera, right? And musical theater and singing as a soprano. This is important. And so when my voice changed several years later, I went through puberty very late, like at 17 years of age. So
Mm,
this identity, I mean, I had done 25 performances of Amal and the Night Visitors, right? This was, I'm in this. I'm doing my college auditions as a soprano. And so when my voice started to change, it was really devastating, right? If I had had words like gender dysphoria, right? If there had been internet available to me, this was in the late 90s, but internet hadn't made it to the farm yet, I probably would have known what was sort of happening with me. But I didn't. I mean, I asked my pediatrician to castrate me because I thought this is the what's best for me. And of course, that pediatrician from a small farm in Ohio was like, laughed it off, right? I mean, just sort of moved on. And I was really lucky, slightly devastated at first that I didn't get into some of these bigger programs. And I went to sort of the backyard school. I grew up very close to Miami University in Ohio, where I did my undergrad, but I had the most extraordinary teacher, this beautiful woman that just sort of accepted me. She had never taught a countergender before. It's not to say she didn't know what she was doing because she's an incredible technician,
Sure.
but she had just never done it before. And she is an incredible technician, high level training in Alexander technique and a big career herself. But what she also was, which I had no idea, was the most accepting person. Like, she was the first person I came out to as being gay. She was the first person I came out to as being trans. Even though I don't use that term now, that was the only word I had back in 2002. And in all cases, she was just like wonderful. Like, she just accepted me in the ways that you want somebody to, didn't start to question me, didn't start to, and she also let me, in a very healthy way, explore repertoire that was fitting my identity along with my voice. I mean, she wouldn't let me sing things like Visidarte, right? I mean, you know what I mean? If I was asking for that, right? There was
Sure.
obviously structure, but because I had grown up singing all these opera roles, she kind of, let me to continue to explore that early on and let me sing art songs that are often from the perspective of women. Like, I sang one of the pieces from the Frauenliebe und Leben with her and other things. I've worked with her on the Chanson de Bilitis, sort of letting me explore that. And then life changed because I got into Chanticleer. So then I went right from undergrad to Chanticleer into this world that was incredible, right? But also very gendered, right? We were called the men of Chanticleer and we dressed in white tie tails and, it was very, very sort of gender binary, which David honestly didn't bother me that much because I literally kept thinking of that scene when Julie Andrews is in Victor Victoria and she appears as a male drag. Like, I don't even know how to describe that, right? And she's in. So that was literally my psyche. That was
Several
like,
levels.
I am like some wild version of Victor Victoria singing in Chanticleer, right? And then I went into grad school in the UK. And then when I was done with that, I thought, oh, I really want to teach. Like, I sort of knew that, even though I loved singing and performing. Um, and so from there, I started to work with LGBTQ choirs in the San Francisco Bay Area. And from there, a singer asked me for some voice lessons. And I said, oh, that'd be great. And I started teaching him some voice lessons. And I thought, oh, his voice operates a little bit differently than other tenors that I had worked with. And I didn't say that to him, right? I'm just thinking, this doesn't really align with some of the things that I know pedagogically about typical tenors, right? And I of course didn't use this phrase with him, but there was a mutational chink in his voice. Um,
Mm,
and so I just thought, okay, great. And we were working together and he was feeling good about the progress he was making. And then, at some point I said, I'm so glad you're feeling good about this. And maybe here are some goals that we should set together. And then finally at one point he said, does any of this make it different because I'm on testosterone? And I said, well, maybe. Why are you on testosterone? And I was still thinking, oh, low testosterone. Maybe he's right, got some medical. It's because he's trans, but I didn't know it. I just had no idea. The year was 2011, 2012. At that time, I couldn't find anything written on trans voice. That sort of well-known article written by Alexander Constancis that came out, I think that was 20, I don't want to say it, maybe 2013, maybe before that. But anyway, I hadn't come across that. I couldn't find it, right? Things were still quite
sure.
scant. Um, and so I then started to work and teach more trans singers because though it was the Bay Area and there are lots of accepting people, it just sort of came to be that people were like, oh, Billy's got some comfortability with this. And by the
Sure.
time I started grad school at Columbia University in New York City, where I was doing a hybrid program, so I was still living in the Bay Area, I sort of entered that program with the intention of this is what my dissertation will be. And so I literally started that grad program sitting down with my incredible advisor, Dr. Goffey Finn, and I said, this is what I want to study. And she said, okay, right? Because we cursory looking at the literature, there was still very little in
Yeah.
2015. I mean, when I started doing conference presentations not long after that, I mean, it was like people were like, oh, Billy's the expert. And I was like, whoa, folks, I am not the expert. I'm a learner in this. I'm still a learner in this. But there was so little that was written about it that it, I mean, Lorraine Sims did some work around that time.
Yep.
It was incredible. And Liz Jackson Hearns and things started to come out. But now here we are, golly, a decade after I started, really sort of sincerely studying this. And what was so interesting, I'm sort of rambling, aren't I? But what was so interesting is when I started this study, even though I had been identifying as a person who's queer, and I don't mean just that as gay, but a person that has sort of played with my gender identity and sort of been aware of fluidity. And, and now I'm very comfortable using the term genderqueer. Honestly, I still hadn't really come to a heightened awareness of how my own teacher and my own life was intersecting in this work, right? I
Mm.
still thought when I entered into the study and doing lit review that it was still going to be like, oh, here's how we teach trans voices, right? As a very sort of, the instrument is a very sort of separate thing from the identity or the person. And like we just need to do these things and then trans singers will be affirmed. And in my mindset, it was still like, oh, we'll teach trans singers like we teach all singers, which of course then the flip story of that when I finally like came to the realization that, oh, we need to teach all singers like we need to teach trans singers, which is to recognize that everybody's voice is different, that everybody's identity perhaps intersects with the way their voice operates. I'm not saying that everybody does, but to take awareness that the way somebody sees themselves in the world may impact the way their voice operates, or they may,
Yeah.
right? And to sort of be in journey with each student, right? To recognize that, I mean, often when we're working with college age students, their voices are literally changing, and yet in the way I would describe it, his history tells us that teaching, conservatory teaching, traditional methods of teaching, it's that we sort of teach the instrument, not the singer. We sort of teach along these sort of, conventional lines of this is what a tenor voice should sound like, and this is what a soprano should sound like, rather than being more in conversation with a student saying, what are your goals? What are your curiosities? And what ways would you like your voice to develop?
Yeah.
Um, so, wow, I really went like really far from the origin story. But
No,
like,
it's great.
because I've just written two autoethnographies, it's really, really difficult for me to sort of piece myself out of the research now.
In chapter two, you share definitions of the word queer. One of my favorites was by Anna Marie Jagos, who defines it as calling into question conventional understandings. Yes, please. I love that. And you argue that queering our teaching cultivates new horizons for diverse and exciting possibilities. And we're going to talk about in just a second what that means in the course of a studio. How do we kind of activate that in the voice studio? But I just, from a philosophical point of view, can you just kind of unpack that a little bit? That idea of how it cultivates new horizons for diverse and exciting possibilities.
I have to tell just a quick story. For the longest time, I really avoided the word queer because it was like the word faggot or gay, but mostly queer and faggot were the words that were like spat at me from school, during school, from like school bullies. And so
Yeah.
I really avoided it. And I had a book on my office desk for like 2 years that I just hadn't opened. Like it was sitting there like on the pile of things to read. And it's called Queer Voices. Um, And Freya Jarman-Ivens is a British scholar, and they wrote this book called Queer Voices, and that was the first thing I finally read about queer voices. But it came about because I was presenting at a conference in Manchester, and afterwards, this person turned out to be Freya, said, "Do you want to get a cup of tea?" And I said, "That sounds great." And so we were chatting and chatting and chatting. And at one point I said, I don't like the word queer. There's this book, and I hadn't pieced together that they were the author of the book. And I said, I haven't been able. Anyway, the point is, Freya has shaped my thinking on queer theory better than anybody else. And so a lot of this comes from Freya's notion and readings of queer theory. And what I love about the word queer, and particularly as the verb I try to use it as in terms of queering,
Hmm.
it's the same etymology as to query, to question, right? And so if we could maintain a sense of querying, right, which I think of as a twofold process, um, then that could shed light on anything, right? It could help us rethink the way repertoire is selected for students. It could help us think the way that we pace voice lessons. It could help us rethink the way we do assessment in the studio, or the way that we operate competitions. And so that's the first prong of it, right? It's like, well, what if I just in the book used queer theory to just question the history of vocal pedagogy, right? And not to sort of say it's been injurious or it's been bad, but just to say, what is it? What has it looked like? And then the second prong of using queer is then to sort of be directing, trying to create space for queer individuals, whoever
Yeah,
that may be. Maybe they're part of the LGBTQ community or not, however they see themselves as queer, right? As an identity marker that they take on to themselves, um, as an opportunity to provide them space within the world of vocal pedagogy, which I argue has traditionally not included them. I also, and I would say, like, going back and reading chapter two now, it's rather circuitous, but it's also like, it's a little bit like, well, here's some loose threads that I'm going to throw out and hope that it resonates with people, right? So I tried to actually find some ways in which I think vocal pedagogy or teaching is already queering. That doesn't mean it's
yeah,
already queer, right? I think there's a definition in saying it's queer, but it's queering. And so I pull in ideas of what does compassionate pedagogy look like? What does student-centered pedagogy look like? What does undoing or dismantling the master-apprentice model look like? As ways of saying, like, I think we're already doing some queering, if you will. Um, so as to not suggest that like the world of vocal pedagogy isn't already sort of making strides to be more affirming and more inclusive, if that
sure.
if that makes sense. So I think those, to sort of go back to the Anna Marie Ghost quote, people are already doing that. I was really just trying to connect some threads, if you will, between the theoretical process or the theoretical framework and sort of processes that are already happening in the world of pedagogy.
Love that.
And
Love
I'm
that.
not sure if
Yeah,
I made that particularly clear in the chapter, but David, you know as well as I do, writing's hard, right? It's hard to sort of, get
yes.
these wild thoughts that live in our brains out on paper, even when you spend years doing it, even when you have editors. Well,
I
I will
mean,
tell you the first version of chapter two, I sent it to my dear friend Josh Paulke, who also writes on trans singing, but from the choral perspective.
uh,
And like some of his feedback was he's like, Billy, it sounds like you hate voice teaching, right? Because I was just in this like I'm questioning everything, and through questioning it, it sort of came across angry, and I was like, "Oh my gosh, no, I love voice teaching. Do you know what I mean, this is my life passion. I don't know how I'm." But then I went back, I sort of took a break from it, and I went, "Oh, because I'm not actually showing the ways in which good things have happened. I'm just calling
Yeah,
into question all the bad things, but also calling into question all the good things," which is why I think in a way that
totally.
chapter turned out to be a little sort of like a roller coaster. We're going to talk about this and that and move from idea to idea, but it was to sort of not to hopefully avoid the idea that I was just an angry person, right? Like I'm not an angry
Oh
gender
yeah, I didn't get that
person.
when I read it at
Okay.
all.
Well,
Yeah, it was
I'm
very
so
clear.
glad. I'll send you version one and you'll be like, whoa, right? But it was to try to find ways that like teachers have been amazing, but like my own beloved teacher, Audrey is her name, Audrey Luna, her approach to teaching doesn't appear in the literature.
Yeah,
Do you know what I mean? Right? Like
yeah,
what appears, what I was reading in the literature is like studies, like, do you know that Duke and Chapman study? It's like the 19 elements of the, applied studio teacher. And it's like, the teacher frequently gives negative feedback or, elements like that that still feel very master apprentice, right? Or still
absolutely.
teacher directed, maybe is a better way to say that. And I kept thinking, well, that's not Audrey at all. She was asking me through inquiry. I mean, she was often saying, and still to this day, because I still sing with her and I'm still in constant contact with her, she'd say, well, what would happen if,
Yeah,
right? What would happen if you allowed, or what would happen if you considered this idea? But I was struggling in the written literature, right? Which is what we sort of have to piece together.
wrestle with. Yep.
Right. Yeah. So anyway,
Yeah, great, 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 great. Oh, I knew this was going to be a great conversation. You write that the act of inclusion enables trans and genderqueer or TGQ singers to participate in only to participate really in a cisnormative space.
mm,
Um, so I take that as what I took from that when I was reading that is like it's the difference between maybe equity and belonging.
mm,
Does that make sense?
yeah.
And so I'm wondering what are some ways that we moved toward belonging? So it's not just that we're saying, yeah, you're welcome here, but it's no, no, no. We are designing the space with you, that you are part of that conversation.
I'm grateful you bring that up, and a lot of people sort of asked me about that and to sort of, talk more about that. I wish I could now go back and work on that section again. Um, so I don't know what I was reading and what influenced me at the time, but in sort of 2019, 2020, as I'm sort of writing the book, it sort of occurred to me that lots of people were using the word inclusive. I was noticing, right? I'm sort of spilling the tea, if you will, right? I'm sort of noticing.
Yes, for the fan.
I was ready. I had a prompt. I always try to
I
show up
love
with
it.
one prompt. Using the word inclusive, but not really knowing what that word meant,
Not
right? Like
defining it.
and defining it. And
Yeah,
I like years before that, I was working with a course that I loved, but I actually had them stop using the word inclusive because I said, they were actually using the phrase wholly inclusive. And I said, you're not wholly inclusive. You're a gay men's course. And there's nothing wrong with being a gay men's course. There needs to be space for women and men and all sorts of folks that are, in protected safe spaces. But we're not wholly inclusive unless we start welcoming everybody under the sun, right? And actually we
sure.
we did. We started to welcome all folks, but there was still an audition process. So we still weren't wholly inclusive, right?
Right.
And and so this got my mind thinking about sort of using the word in a more critical way and just being more thoughtful. I think as words become buzzwords, they start to lose their meaning or their intensity, right?
Yeah.
So like I started to hear a lot of people use the word like student agency or self-autonomy, and you're like, okay, but have you really considered what that word meant? So if we're really going to consider what the word inclusive means, then it means that we need to change the space that we're welcoming people into, right? For example, we can't be a church that puts up a sign that says all people are welcome if we're not actually going to redefine who we are as a church, right? So I would take umbrage with the voice teacher that says, I'm very inclusive. I welcome all people to my studio. If you've not taken a deep dive in like every single style of singing and every like I'm very aware as a voice teacher that I can teach certain styles of music. I feel comfortable in certain coaching certain styles of singing. But there are others that I'm not comfortable with. When a musical theater student comes to me and wants to learn belting, I'm like, that is so exciting. Guess who doesn't know how to belt? And I'll give you a free lesson just to see if I can give you some ideas. But that's it. Let me
Yeah.
redirect you to somebody who knows. That would not be very inclusive of me to say I can teach all styles of music and then I haven't really gone into learning all these styles of music, right? And so what I was just thinking about was that if we don't change the space in which we're welcoming people into, then we're just really welcoming people into a white, hetero, cis normative space that is actually not welcoming. You've just opened the doors, but you've not actually opened the doors to a place that's really welcoming and really provides a sense of belonging for those individuals.
Right.
So using the
You
word
know,
inclusive is in fact in some ways dangerous, right? It's unsafe to sort of put up these symbols, these signs of I'm inclusive, but I've not really done the deep self-interrogation of myself or my teaching praxis to really be welcoming for whomever I'm trying to welcome in.
and continue to commit to doing that because we're never done with that.
Well, that's right. And that's why I
Yeah.
love queer theory. It's because queer theory calls on the idea of constantly questioning. And so once something becomes normative, it is no longer by definition queer, which I am obsessed with because the moment that I think, oh yeah, I've kind of sorted this out, I'm like good at this, nope, then it's not queer anymore. Then I've got to dig deeper. I've got to interrogate even more carefully. I've got to keep querying, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. And that's hard. That's
Yeah,
hard.
yeah.
As and it sounds like what I'm taking from our conversation is, we've both been blessed to have teachers who have demonstrated that,
Mhm,
right?
mhm,
And we may have, teachers or colleagues that don't.
mhm,
And I have um, as I get older, I have a sympathy for those who don't. I
mhm,
have an understanding for those who don't, even though I think it really is necessary because it's hard. It's
mhm,
hard, it's vulnerable, it
mhm,
asks a lot of us,
mhm.
and
It's
and
exhausting actually at times
it
because
can
it
be.
requires being very present, right? And sometimes I think it is just easier to sort of sit down at the piano and start going through the vocalises, right? That you've done 187,000 times and you know that they work, but that may not be where that student is that day,
Right, right.
right? And it may be where that student is that day, right? And then you're also thinking like, oh my gosh, that jury is coming up, which that's a whole phrase that I don't like, but right, you know what I mean. Our listeners
I
know,
know exactly what you mean.
right? Or that competition is coming up, or that audition that they're doing. And you're like, we have got to get on, right?
Yeah,
But we also have to spend a couple of moments to sort of find each other together, to practice empathy. Empathy's like all of this is sort of wrapped around compassion and empathy as well, right? You
Yeah.
can you can tell that there's a lot of sort of words that I use that are all sort of swarming around this idea of what queering means, but queering also means to be constantly empathetic, which means that we have to journey with each student. We have to walk side by side with them.
Yeah.
And sometimes that actually means getting ahead of them maybe a little bit, and sometimes that means getting behind them and pushing them a little bit, but that's actually following their lead. I find it very difficult to be student-centered, particularly in large ensembles, since I'm also a choir director,
Sure.
right? I find that very tricky. The concert's coming up. There's like looming dates for whatever we've got to get on and learn the music. I mean, you can see my body language is even changing, right? And then I have to think to myself, this is not who I want to be, right? This is not how I want to be with my students, right? It's not how I want to be with my friends. It's how I want to be with anybody, right? And so I have to take that moment to say, take a deep breath, allow yourself to be in the moment. But that's challenging when I'm
Yeah.
at a university right now where many of the student support offices have just been shut down. The LGBTQ center has been closed. The staff that worked in that have been fired. The women's center is gone. The multicultural center has been closed, right? So I'm already sort of girding my loins, if you will, for, when we start up next month about how much more supportive I'm going to need to be for students and the sort of emotional toll that's going to take on me because we as teachers have only so much bandwidth,
Yeah.
right? And also, I think this is important in this part of the conversation is we aren't therapists, right? We're not
Correct.
mental health workers, right? We can be empathetic, we can be compassionate, we can attempt to journey with our students, as I was talking about. My friend Megan Durham, who I know you interviewed, she and I love the phrase co-learn, right? I co-learn with my students. So all of that is in the notion of pedagogy, right? It's
Yes.
not, and if that helps somebody with their mental health or the way they're seeing themselves in the world, that's great. But I'm also aware that I need to keep a list of folks that these students can turn to if they need something more than just the beauty of having a trauma-informed, student-centered, compassionate, queering teacher,
Yeah.
right? Uh,
Totally.
so as an important, I think, point in all this, as we're talking about all these words, there's also a limit to what we can and should do as
Yeah.
teachers.
In your book, you mentioned you examined these 6 case studies of student teacher pairs, and the gender identity or expression between teacher and student is mostly different, I believe. And I want to really encourage all of us to read your book and really take in kind of the totality of the findings. And I just, what's coming to me in this moment as I'm thinking about my own questions, I just want to make sure that. I think the way that I had initially asked this question, Billy, is that, can you give us some insights or observations that we can use kind of across the board? But I also just want to really be mindful to center trans and genderqueer folks and their experience. And so I'm wondering if maybe rather than thinking of it the way that it was, can you share some things that feel maybe specific to transgender and genderqueer people, how we can be more supportive and trauma informed teachers for that community.
Yeah, I can try. I can try. I mean, I would say that what came first in writing queer and vocal pedagogy was the data that I was seeing in collecting, information from watching voice lessons and interviewing the teachers and the students. And so the whole notion of queering is in fact the large takeaway, even though that comes first in the book, right? That's like the framework
Sure.
before that's also sort of the big takeaway at the end. Is that what I was seeing, at least in these case studies, is this notion of teachers being is leading through inquiry, is being very present with their students, is was sort of leading from a place of compassion and spending a few moments at the beginning of each lesson and checking in on how the student is doing and inviting questions throughout the lessons. And I understand that partly that's because when I reached out to find teachers, and students who would be interested in this research, which can be emotional laborious for participants, was that I was also looking for voice teachers who had been teaching trans singers for a while. And
Sure.
I was hopefully entering that a studio space where the teacher had become known for being affirmative or being inclusive or being supportive in whatever ways possible. And those big takeaways was sort of this leading through inquiry and being really present with the students, allowing the students to have sort of self-agency over what vocal leases they did or how they paced their lessons or how they even structured their lessons. I mean, as student-centered as my undergraduate and my graduate voice teacher both were, I do think in all cases I like came in and the expectation was we were going to sing vocal leases and then work on repertoire. And
Sure.
I was being guided through those exercises, or now we're going to work on this song, right? That the pacing or the right, which is fine, right? Because I felt very affirmed in that and that worked very well for me. But a student-centered model is, how would you like to begin today? Are you fully warmed up? Would you like to do some vocal leases, or do you want to jump into repertoire? Right? Because I don't know, maybe that student has come with a very clear direction on what they need in that time that we're spending together. And and then I will often say, oh, great, so we'll start with some vocal leases. Is there one that feels like it would be really yummy for you or where you'd like to begin? Because frankly, if they've already done semi-occluded vocal tract exercises for the last half hour, then maybe we don't need to be doing some more lip buzz.
Sure.
If they're ready to jump in with something with flexibility, then I'd like to just begin where they are and then also ask them about, what repertoire would you like to get to today? Because then we may work backwards on, okay, so if we're going to work on whatever song, Down by the Sally Gardens, then what vocal leases do you think would be good ones to get us vocally ready for that song? Because I'm also trying to get them to think about that the 6 days that I don't see them between their lessons, they're their own teacher. These were things that I saw generally very heightened in these six case studies. And that's why, and I'm sure, David, you're going to say, oh, Billy, there's all these books, but I was not familiar with a vocal pedagogy book that sort of took the reader into the studio of a teacher and a student. I mean, partly because the pedagogy books I grew up with were like amazing, but like Barbara Doscher's,
Sure.
Richard Miller, McKinney, The Vocal Faults, right? And those are beautiful books, right? In ways, right? But they're structured not from that sort of student teacher
Right.
model, but from like okay, we've got a student with fast vibrato, how do we fix it? Or we have a student that, needs work on a poggio. Well, what is a poggio and how do we teach that, right? And
Right.
I just wondered if I could sort of give more insight to the actual what was happening between student and teacher. And I hope I did. But I would say the overall takeaway is that sort of notion of student centeredness and really giving the student agency over not just their like how they're structuring the lesson, but also long-term development.
It's a reminder to me that like the thing that is specific is also universal. Like this idea of like so in working with trans and genderqueer community, you know, being student centered. Well, yes, of course, and so that can mean lots of different things, right? Depending on the person in front of you, but that is something that is also universal that we can apply to everyone, which is what I love. That's great.
Yeah. Even through grad school, when I was taking like upper level pedagogy classes, as much as I loved those instructors, I had never come across the idea of student-centered pedagogy or
Yeah,
compassionate pedagogy or these until I was doing my doctorate. And that's when
sure.
like Dr. Goffey Finn used these models in her applied lesson teaching class. And I was like, whoa, like this is revolutionary for me because up to that point, it was still this idea, a notion that the teacher is here to correct,
Yeah,
that the teacher is here to fix and modify the singer's voice as based on the teacher's awareness of what is needed in the industry. Right.
right.
And I understand that we still have that job, that students are coming to us for
Sure.
that, right? But also, how do we change the industry if we don't change teaching?
Hello.
I'm just not sure. Like people have said to me, well, but are your students getting hired for these roles or whatever? And I'm like, well, actually, yes. But why is that the measure of success? Why couldn't the measure of success be that, and I don't have this data, I'm not saying this is true, right? But why isn't the measure of success for a voice teacher is that the students who leave their studio still love singing? Why isn't the measure of success that the students who leave those studios are still singing in their car, in the shower, or in the community choir or wherever singing could happen for them, and they still love it?
Yeah.
But I have so many, many dear friends that have degrees in voice who do not like singing at this point in their life because
Yeah.
it's too much of like
Fraught.
constantly judging themselves, and it's fraught with I have to sound these specific ways. But what if your vibrato is a little wider on your high G? Who cares? You still have a high G and I don't, right? And like, I don't know. Do you know what I mean? Like
Yeah.
that, and I know that, people move on and their lives and their interests change, and
Oh,
that's
sure.
fine. But it is sort of a pattern that I've seen where I know lots of people with, you know, BMs or BAs and their primary, instrument was voice, and now they don't do anything with it.
Yeah.
But yet when we measure success of a teacher, we're like, well, my students have sung at the Metropolitan, they've won, Nats competitions and blah blah blah. And I would like to say my students still sing in the shower.
Yeah.
And they also go and win Nats competitions, and they also go on to be really awesome teachers themselves or whatever, right? But
Right.
but all of the possibilities. Um,
Right.
so yeah.
Yeah. Oh my gosh, this has been such a rich conversation. I'm so grateful for your time today, um, and yeah, and I look forward to reading more of your work and just seeing you. I think I see you ICVT. Are you?
Yes.
Yes, so I get to see you in
Yeah.
an actual person, you and Megan.
Yes.
So I'm very much looking forward to that as
Yeah.
well, and I'm so grateful for this moment of connection. Thank you so much, Billy.
Thank you, David.
What are the ways that you're creating and inviting equitable space for your trans or genderqueer students? And what are the ways in which you see creating that space, create space for people of all identities and backgrounds in your studio? Please sound off. Email me at wholeheartedvoicepedagogy@gmail.com. And as always, you can follow me on my socials. My handle on most platforms is at Sisco Songs and at Wholehearted Voice Pedagogy. I would love to discuss this with you. And as always, I just want to encourage you to not only subscribe to the podcast, which please do that, but also please share this with a friend or a colleague you think would get something out of this. I love this work that we're doing together. It makes me so happy and proud to be a teacher. More soon. Take care of you.